Hello there! Welcome back to another video about books. Today we're talking about an Argentinian book called Tender is the Flesh, which I recently read. Maybe you've heard of this book, maybe you haven't. If you like books that really make you think about things that you otherwise maybe would never think about, or never even think about thinking about, you would probably like this book. However, this is one of those kinds of books where it's hard to say that you like it, that you just enjoyed it, that it was a fun read, because it's such a heavy topic that even though it is a fantastic book, it's also very hard to read because of the content and the subject matter. This is going to be kind of a book review, but kind of just me talking about the book, some of my opinions on the message and the theme of the book. So there will be spoilers. If you haven't read it, maybe read it before you watch this video. Or if you like spoilers and that, entices you to read a book, definitely stick around. Before we get started, please take a moment to click the like button and subscribe. It really helps this channel out and I really appreciate it. And leave me a comment also and let me know if you've read this or if you plan to read it. So let me tell you what this story is about. This is a dystopian novel. It takes place in kind of an altered version of the future. It's also kind of speculative in a way. And at the very beginning of the story, we're made aware of the fact that a virus has hit the entire planet and made all animals poisonous to humans in terms of factory farming and in terms of just having a pet in your home. So all animals have been destroyed by humans, even cats and dogs, and it's no longer legal or ethical to have an animal in your house. In fact, places like zoos are completely empty and basically like ghost towns because there are no animals to speak of anymore. It implies that somewhere deep in the wilderness there probably still are some animals that got away, but I don't think you really ever encounter any throughout the story except for one specific part toward the middle of the story, but we'll get to that in a minute. As far as just, seeing a duck in a pond or a squirrel in a tree, you don't have that in this story world. This whole event is referred to as the transition, and a lot of the characters kind of express opinions off and on throughout the story that they think maybe there really was no virus and maybe it's just a big conspiracy. Sounds kind of familiar, but for the most part, everybody obeys these new laws and rules, and this is just how people in society live. Then humans being humans decide that if they can't eat animals, they gotta eat something. This is where they begin to factory farm other humans. Now the story never really explains what the difference is between the people who are allowed to just live on in society and kind of have normal lives and the people who are kept in captivity and bred and farmed. It never goes into detail about why there was a distinction made between different types of people. There's not really any clear indication of motivation here because people are just eating people and it's kind of a free-for-all. Okay, it's not really a free-for-all, it's factory farming but with humans. This is pretty much a story about how humans have achieved their final form and become the ultimate monsters. So our main character's name is Marcos. And Marcos is kind of a bigwig at a factory farm processing plant. His mom's passed away, his dad is elderly and sick and in a nursing home. His sister is kind of a Karen. His wife left him. He had a kid, but his kid died. He has some co-worker friends who he just gets along with, but he doesn't really have anyone in his life at the moment when the story really gets started. Marcos spends a lot of time lamenting the loss of his child and the subsequent loss of his wife who left him after they lost their child. Marcos is a very judgmental main character. From the beginning of the story, he's very judgy of the world around him and he has a lot of very strong feelings and opinions on all of it. He's not happy with his job, and it's clear to the reader that he's only doing this job because he has to, because somebody's got to pay for his dad's nursing home, and his Karen sister is definitely not going to be the one to do it. So Marcos is pretty much stuck in between a rock and a hard place. And for all intents and purposes, throughout the first part of the book, you kind of get the feeling that maybe Marcos is the only sane person left in this dystopian world. Maybe he's the only good person left. We'll get to that. As As the story progresses, we start to learn about the new factory farming industry and how it functions basically now that special meat has replaced what used to be meat. And by special meat, I mean humans. These humans are bred and kept in captivity. It even talks about how they've had their vocal cords cut so that they can't speak or scream. They're very much feral and very much like wild animals and very dehumanized. They live pretty much just like cattle. These farmed humans face a variety of horrific fates. There's not just the food processing plant. There's trophy hunting. There's laboratory testing, pretty much anything that animals in our real society go through. These factory farmed humans called heads experience those same things. It's easy to draw the conclusion pretty early on in the story, like pretty much from page 1, that the author is making a big old obvious comparison to the way animals in our world are treated and the way these humans are treated. But the themes don't really stop there. That's maybe the biggest theme, but there are kind of a dozen other smaller themes that go along with this that unfold as you move throughout the story. And that's one of the reasons I wanted to make a video about this book, is because I think there's a lot to talk about with this book, and I watched a few videos where people, kind of reviewed it, and it seemed to go over a lot of people's heads. I think most people just read it and thought, ooh, this is gross, I wouldn't want to eat people, but it goes so much deeper than that. If that's really all you took away from the book, then you really missed a lot. So back to the story. Because Marcos is kind of a head honcho at the processing plant, he has a lot of contacts who are also pretty high up the food chain. That's an unfortunate pun. And because of his connections, he ends up in the possession of a GMO head. This is basically a genetically modified 30-some-year-old woman. She's a gift for Marcos, and she's delivered to his house from this colleague, this person he works with. Now, I can't remember the guy's name because I'm horrible at remembering character names for some reason. So the delivery guy pulls up, drops this woman off, and Marcos is like, what is this? I don't want it. I can't take care of it. And there's a lot of dehumanization in this book, so she's seen as a product, basically. The delivery guy refuses to take back the GMO head and leaves her with Marcos. Marcos has a lot going on in his life. He does not have time to take care of it, and he also is not much of a meat eater himself. He just kind of reluctantly takes her and puts her in the barn, and then he goes on about his business. Through his eyes, we see the situation that his dad's in. We hear a pretty elaborate explanation of what happens or what can happen to elderly people who are abandoned in elderly folks' homes. As you can imagine, they are eaten in some circumstances. There's also, I should probably mention, there are feral people. I forget what they called them. Scavengers, I think. They're feral people that live basically outside of society. They're neither product nor part of the social class, and they're just kind of feral people who hang out around processing plants and like in the woods and stuff, and it never really says where they live, but you kind of assume that maybe they're just like wild people who maybe live in caves or something. Who knows? A lot of times they end up getting the meat that nobody else wants, so that's always an option, to throw your elderly people to the scavengers. Marcus is continually going back and thinking about the past and times he had with his father. He also spends a lot of time in the past thinking about his child and his wife and the way things used to be. Very frequently throughout the story, he stops at a zoo and goes in and just sits around and thinks. It's like this is the place where he goes to remember the past. It's a very sad situation, the way that the book describes it, because the zoo, like I said earlier, is pretty much a ghost town. There are no animals. A lot of people at this point in time in the story don't really even know much about animals, because maybe the animals were already gone before they were even born, and so some people maybe haven't even seen animals. There's graffiti all over the walls, things are broken, things are desecrated, but Marcos goes here to think. to just live in the past because that's what he spends most of his time doing. At one point in the story, he goes over to his sister's house, and this kind of gives the reader an opportunity to get to know the other part of his family. So like I said, his sister's pretty much a Karen, and she's one of those people who has kids and, you know, has a home and everything, but she's always forevermore complaining how broke she is and that she doesn't have money for this or that or whatever. And that's what this character, his sister, pretty much uses as a loophole to skirt responsibility for taking care of their elderly sick father. We also learn that his sister's very ignorant and blissful. She's pretty much complacent in the world of this story, and she's one of those people who doesn't really see past the end of her own nose. His sister's two kids are pretty much ultimate monsters, even though they're very young. That kind of gives you a glimpse into the new generation of this story universe of, you know, there's still people alive like Marcos who remember animals, who maybe even had pets at one point in time, but the younger generations have been born into a world that is so horrific, they have no empathy. And it's not a theme that's really explored much in the story, but if you really think about it, the author did a great job at kind of giving you the beginnings of this thought concept about how without animals and without even like companion animals, how it takes away a piece of our own humanity. Because I'm telling you, these two kids are little shits from hell. They pretty much have no soul. And one of the things that we see pretty prominently when Marcos visits the zoo is that people who come in to vandalize and, you know, teenagers who come in to just drink and party and do whatever, they leave graffiti on the walls that sometimes is denigrating to these animals that maybe they never even saw in person because maybe they were all gone before these kids were born. So there's a lot to talk about there when it comes to how the relationship between humans and animals changed so drastically and how the lack of animals in our world changed us. As we're experiencing the world, we see humanity around him is declining to a point that is beyond terrifying. And I think that this particular sub-theme comes through pretty clear with the two kids, his niece and nephew. There's a couple of moments of dialogue exchanged where it kind of makes it clear that those two little bastards would eat him in a heartbeat if given a chance. Marcos is continually identifying all of these things in society that have changed, and he's judging them harshly, and he's thinking deep thoughts about them. And then he goes on with his life. He goes back to work. He, you know, does the things he's obligated to do. And in the meantime, he starts to see the GMO head, and I keep calling her GMO, but I'm not sure if that's entirely accurate. That's the way I took it, is that like she's basically genetically modified, so I could be wrong-ish about that. But basically the product that was delivered to his house, he starts to see her differently. And he sees her in a lustful way to begin with, but for a moment, for several chapters, you kind of start to think that maybe he's falling in love with her because he spends so much time lamenting the loss of his wife. You know, now that he has this human, even though, you know, no, you're not really supposed to see her as human, and it's actually illegal to treat her as another human because she's a product, it starts to bring out a different side in him. And so there are a few moments where he starts to get closer to her a little bit at a time. It starts with him bathing her, and then he, you know, in another scene is smelling her, and he's becoming attracted to her, and it never clarifies what his intentions are. It just makes the reader assume that perhaps, you know, she's filling a void in his life. I want to bring up something that I saw on Goodreads about this part of the story and about the ending in particular. So if you're cool with the spoilers up till this point, this is going to directly address the end of the book, but avoid this part. There was a comment I saw on Goodreads that said something about, I can't believe that Marcos did such a 180 at the end of the book. He didn't. He actually didn't, because from, you know, pretty early on, you know, from the time that the head is delivered to his house, you know, to all of the things that he begrudgingly does to take care of her, they're all very minimal things. They're not things that you do when you love or care about another human being or another creature in general. They're things that you have to do in order to achieve a certain result. So Marcos basically does the bare minimum to take care of this woman, this GMO head, but the book makes you think that he's falling genuinely in love with her. And she ends up becoming pregnant, which is, I think, the ultimate crime in their society. And the book kind of goes over it in a few different instances leading up to this, that, it's a huge penalty to have relations with a head. In the end of the story, when he ultimately betrays her and proves that he didn't care about her, people were surprised by that, but I actually saw it coming from a mile away, and I knew for sure that I was right at the point in the story with the puppies. The first time he saw the puppies and the last time he saw the puppies. And if you've read the book, you know what I'm talking about. There's some pretty horrific animal abuse in this story. One scene in particular is pretty terrible, and there were some feral puppies and some feral dogs living in the zoo, and he had discovered them at one point in the story, and he played with them, and it's kind of amazing how the author managed to paint this picture where on one side of the coin it looked wholesome and it looked like, oh, this is wonderful. The main character is getting to have an actual real life experience of something from his past rather than having to sit in the zoo by himself and just recall things that happened previously in his life when times were better. Because he actually plays with these puppies and he gives them names. But there was also something like on the other side of the coin that was eerie about the way that he played with these puppies and the way that he perceived this experience. And it was very unsettling to me as I read it. And I thought, obviously something bad is going to happen to these puppies. And I think he's going to be kind of at the root of it. He's not the one that got rid of the puppies, we'll just put it that way. At one point, Marcos stops by the zoo, and this is pretty late in the story, probably, 60 to 75% into the story. I think his dad had passed away at this point, or was about to. I can't remember. Well, anyway, he stops by the zoo, and a bunch of teenagers have found the puppies. And so some really horrific stuff happens to the puppies. And Marcos just stands there and watches. He doesn't try to stop them. He could have done something to intervene to save these poor puppies. And he didn't. He just stood there and watched. There were several times in this book when I almost stopped reading it. Not because the book is bad or anything, but because I couldn't emotionally handle it. From that moment on, I knew that Marcos was definitely a piece of shit, and that all the clues that I had picked up from him and about him throughout the story had been correct. And also from that moment on, I was so hoping that something awful would happen to him in the story. I just wanted him to meet some horrific demise, which he doesn't. He actually has a happy ending for him, and it leaves you with a very bad taste in your mouth. At least it did me, because I did not get to see him suffer as I hoped that he would. So, okay, skipping ahead to the end of the story, this is the ending, so again, giant spoiler. The GMO head / the woman / Jasmine, he named her Jasmine, gives birth. And while she's in labor, Marcos calls his ex-wife or wife, estranged wife, whatever she is, and she used to be a nurse. So he has her come over and deliver the baby. As soon as it's born, he kills the GMO head. You kind of think for a minute or two that maybe he's going to try to give her a better life. Maybe he's going to do something selfless. He doesn't. He kills her. Throughout the entire story, he was using her. And, she being a feral human who was bred and raised in captivity, she has little to no intelligence, and so she also can't communicate too, because her vocal cords have been cut, so she can't speak, she can't express herself in any way. But she, throughout the end part of the story, she had started to show signs of understanding affection and something that's kind of innate to humans, and she was very affectionate with him, and clearly she loved him, and he was the only person who had ever been kind to her. And so it made it extra sad at the end when it's officially revealed that he betrayed her and that he used her for his own personal gain. So how I said there are multiple themes throughout this story? Well, one of the other big themes, in my opinion, and this is just my perception of it, you may have a different perception when you read it, it's not only, surface level of how society treats animals, but it has a lot to do with how ruthless humans can be when it comes to satisfying gluttonous urges. And I think ultimately, you could say that that's the major theme throughout the entire story. And it is, but it kind of ebbs and flows to varying degrees with the different scenarios, and everything kind of stays, all of the different major themes and sub-themes kind of stay within the same umbrella, but this one I think is the one that hit me the hardest, surprisingly. But throughout the story, Marcos is just such a judgy bastard, and he has all of these strongly held opinions about society and the way things are collapsing, but he's no different. Of all the characters in the story, you're led to believe throughout the whole story that he may be the only good and sane person left, but he's as big a monster as anybody else. I also really appreciated how the author executed the internal flaw of the main character and their need/want, because all stories, the main character always has like a desire, some tangible goal that they need to strive for, and it never clearly states at the beginning of the story what Marcos really wants out of life and what he thinks will fix his life. But you start to realize toward the end of the story that what his ultimate goal was in the beginning was to reproduce, to have a kid. And because him and his wife couldn't achieve that, he found an opportunity to basically execute this spur-of-the-moment plan and achieve his goal, regardless of who he hurt in the process. Again, kind of coming full circle with that gluttonous desire to fill your every whim. I think that seeing this level of gluttony and betrayal from the characters and just the declining humanity across the board is one of the things that makes this story feel so devastating. Overall, this story I would definitely recommend it if you haven't got that yet from, everything I've said so far. I would definitely recommend anybody who reads books, read it. If you don't read books, read this book and keep an open mind, because I know exactly how a lot of people will react to the whole, animal-human relationship part of it. Because I know how people feel about eating meat, and I definitely think that a lot of people in real life would probably be willing to eat humans if the only alternative was not having meat. I know people who would eat people. But yeah, so definitely read this book. It's incredible. It's grotesquely beautiful, and it's gut-wrenching. It is really hard to read, but I think there's so many important messages in this book and so many things to think about. You really could just talk all day about it. I don't think I've even really touched on half of the things that, I probably in editing will be like, damn, I wish I had talked about that, but there's so much to talk about with this one. It's kind of hard to cover it all in a short YouTube video, but definitely would be glad to talk to you all in the comments section about it. There are a couple of other things that I wanted to mention. One of the things being something I saw on Goodreads. One of the reviews, it was a negative review, it was like a 1 or 2 star review, and the commenter said something about the heinous treatment of women and minorities in this book. And I've just got to throw this in here because this is something that I'm seeing more and more of, especially on Goodreads. I don't think I really see it anywhere else, but a lot of books that I've read in the last year or so that were great books are getting this type of feedback. I have to wonder, who are these readers? They don't understand. Yeah, there are going to be stories with these types of topics and these types of characters, because that's what makes them villains. And so essentially in Tender is the Flesh, the main character is as much a villain as anybody else. So yeah, of course he's going to do unspeakable things. But I see so many comments on Goodreads, especially, like I said, where people just seem to misunderstand the entire story. It's not just blatant misogyny just because the character is a horrible person. You know what I mean? And that just seems to be rampant these days amongst younger readers. And I just wonder, like, are younger readers not grasping the concept that villains are supposed to be villainous? What is it that you're not getting about fiction writing and literature? Like, they're supposed to be bad people. That's the whole point of a villain, is they do bad things. And that's just one thing I wanted to kind of tack on to the end of this video. And it goes without saying, I think, that the characters in this book were very well-rounded and very well written. This entire book was very well written. It's pretty much flawless. I don't think it really could have been written any better than it is. So definitely check this book out. If you've read this book, leave me a comment. Let's talk about it in the comment section. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, don't forget to click the like button and subscribe and stick around for more spooky content, more book content, and more mystical content coming soon. Also, check out my social media links in the description box. Paranormally Correct has a TikTok, and I would really appreciate if you guys would go over to TikTok, because YouTube hates me and they're suppressing my channel, and I'm just really tired of it. So there's gonna be a lot more paranormal content on the TikTok channel. Anyway, thank you for watching, and until next time, bye.